In this video, I'm going to be talking about how to come to a decision as an adjudicator. So basically what we'll be going through is firstly, how to decide what kind of clashes or main questions will decide the debate. Secondly, how to decide which team actually wins each of those. And then thirdly, weighing those ideas up. So when we're deciding on clashes, we want to sort the debate into 2 to 3 determinative clashes. Obviously, in a debate, there are many micro-level things which the teams have argued about, which they've clashed on. But we can't go through each one individually, and not each one individually is necessarily that important in the debate. So our job is to organize them so that we can structure our oral adjudication, but maybe more importantly, to work out which ideas really matter in the debate. So some common examples, which you will often find yourself using and which sometimes overlap, are dividing the debate into principal and practical arguments, separating out different types of stakeholders. So for example, in education debates, often we'll be thinking about different types of students, or students versus academics versus parents and so forth. And then thirdly, sometimes we'll be separating out ideas by types of impact. So how will this impact society politically versus socially? How will an education policy impact students' social well-being versus their academic results? All right, next up, we're going to decide who wins each clash. So ultimately, we're asking which team has more persuasively met their burdens on each clash. And to make that choice, we're going to be thinking about which team's logic was more sound. So perhaps one team didn't necessarily prove their arguments as thoroughly as another, in which case it would be reasonable for us to believe the argument which was more thoroughly proven, which was based on less assertions. Secondly, which team's characterization of the world was more likely. So maybe one team has really fleshed out their sort of picture that they've provided to you of reality. Maybe it's more believable, and as a result, you're going to find it more persuasive. Alternatively, maybe one team has provided a clearer explanation of stakeholders' incentives. It just makes more sense to you, and that allows you to believe their claims a little bit more. While doing this, we should also be thinking about how close each win was. So we don't necessarily just want to decide, well, affirmative won this clash outright. Sometimes they might, but we should also be thinking about what that margin is. So maybe the overall benefit, while clear, was pretty slight. It was only a small group of actors, or it just wasn't very severe. It didn't make much of a difference. Alternatively, maybe one team has very clearly won a clash. Maybe they've provided a massive overwhelming benefit. And so it can be really useful to take note, not just of who has won each clash, but also how much you think that they actually won by, what you think the overall difference they've made to the world is. That will help you later on when you decide which clash really matters. So deciding who wins the debate. Once we've worked out all of our clashes, we need to decide who has won overall. Maybe a team has clearly won all the clashes, in which case the results can be pretty clear. But in some debates, teams will have won different ideas, and you need to decide how to weigh them up. An important thing to note is you shouldn't decide the debate just by looking at who has won the majority of the clashes. It's not a maths equation. A team could win 2 out of 3 clashes, but still lose the debate if the other team has won the most important and debate-winning arguments. So for example, in an education debate, if the negative proved that parents and teachers were harmed by the affirmative model, but affirmative proved massive benefits for students, then affirmative could probably still win if we care most about students. Similarly, if the affirmative narrowly wins 2 practical arguments in the debate, but a negative team proves that the affirmative model is super immoral, then the negative could totally win, because we might decide that those practical arguments aren't worth that massive moral harm. So we're not going to decide the debate just by working out who wins the majority of the clashes. Often that will correlate with the result of the debate, but we've got to think about it a little bit more deeply. So what we're going to do is weigh up which themes particularly matter, which clashes particularly matter. And the metrics for deciding this will obviously vary based on the debate. And sometimes teams will make arguments about which things that they think you should weigh. And so you can take that into account as well. However, here are some common ways of weighing up arguments that might help you to make that call. So firstly, it can be useful to think about which impact is the biggest. So which impact affects the largest group of people, or maybe not people, maybe it could be something like animals, but which impact is the largest in scale. Secondly, we might think about which impact is the strongest, which impact has the most profound effect on people's lives. So you could have one clash, which is very widespread, which impacts people a little bit. And then you could have another clash, which impacts only a few people, but it's like a matter of life and death. And I think it would be reasonable in that instance to prioritize the much more severe, much stronger claim, even if it affects fewer people. Thirdly, sometimes there will be impacts which we have a special principled reason to care about. For example, if we have a clash which is talking about a particularly vulnerable group of people, or if we have a clash maybe about children who the state has a special obligation to protect. In that instance, we might be justified in weighing it a bit more over other impacts, because not only is it a practical harm or benefit, but it has a kind of principled aspect that means that we should care about it more. Finally, like I mentioned on the previous slide, we should be thinking about how large the margins of victory were between each point. So maybe one point is pretty marginal. One team wins quite closely. They do provide a small benefit, but it doesn't really seem to be that wide-ranging. It doesn't seem to change the world that significantly. That is a useful kind of proxy for understanding how large, I suppose, how strong their benefits were. So those are some strategies we can use to think about who has won each issue, but oftentimes it will be quite intuitive, and you can think through which things seemed most persuasive, seemed most likely proved the debate was either a net harm or a net benefit. So here's an example about how these things might work out in practice. In a debate about cancel culture, affirmative suggests that cancel culture is really important for holding celebrities accountable. They tell us that these people in power don't really, they evade justice most of the time. There's not really a way for ordinary people to get justice against them. Whereas negative says, no, cancel culture is bad. It can ruin the lives of ordinary people. It can mean that people lose their jobs and things like that. And that's really regrettable. If we're weighing this up, I think there's a couple of possibilities depending on how the debate went. So maybe affirmative has proven that it is mainly celebrities who get cancelled because they're so high profile and people don't really care about ordinary people that much. And if that's the case, we might just prioritize the benefits they're provided, because those benefits occur in the majority of cases, because we're generally talking about celebrities when we're talking about cancel culture. Alternatively, maybe the negative has showed that the impact on ordinary people's lives of being cancelled, they're just so massive. There are people losing their jobs, literally never being able to kind of recover from that. And as a result, those impacts are they're so meaningful that they should be prioritized above perhaps more mild or less meaningful changes on the affirmative side. Finally, maybe either team could provide a principle which would help us decide who the most important stakeholder is. So affirmative might make a claim like, well, we think in general people get cancelled for things like being particularly bigoted or for like discriminatory behavior. And we think that it's right that people experience consequences for that, even if those consequences aren't that palatable. And that might tell us that we should deprioritize the negatives arguments about ordinary people's lives being ruined, because obviously they did something wrong in the first instance. Whereas on the flip side, negative might say, principally, we should care about due process. We don't want people's lives to be ruined based on kind of a mob just deciding that they're cancelled, and that even if those people, aren't perfect, it's a big principled harm that their lives are being ruined. So you can kind of link the different claims made in different portions of the debate, the principle and the practical, to work out which in this example, which stakeholder matters the most, but obviously in other debates could be which impact matters the most. So at the end of this video, basically the thing to take away is when we're adjudicating, our process for making the decision of the debate is essentially going to be, firstly, we're going to divide the debate into kind of bite-sized chunks that allow us to consider who sort of won those chunks of material. We're going to try to do that sort of thematically. Then secondly, we're going to decide who won each of those chunks. We'll do that based on overall how persuasive they are, what kind of overall change to the world we believe that they're going to make, how well they've fleshed that out, explained it with logic and with characterization. And then thirdly, we're going to weigh up the different clashes in the debate, thinking through the size, the severity, and the sort of principled weight of each of those impacts.